On the moonless night of July 14, 1918, along the Marne River in France, German stormtroopers of the 7th Army made their final preparations. They checked the stick grenades hanging from their belts, oiled the bolts of their rifles, and whispered final words to their comrades in the suffocating darkness of the assault trenches. They were the elite, the tip of the spear of the German Imperial Army, and they were about to launch what their supreme commander, Erich Ludendorff, had named the Friedensturm, the peace offensive. This was to be the final, war-winning blow, a massive hammer strike designed to shatter the Allied lines, cross the Marne, and march on Paris before the newly arrived American armies could make their presence felt. The soldiers were confident. For 4 years, their doctrine had been perfected. A short, hurricane-like artillery barrage, followed by a rapid, overwhelming infantry assault. They would smash the French front line, pour through the gap, and the war would be over by autumn. At exactly 12:10 a.m. on July 15th, thousands of German guns opened fire, unleashing a torrent of high-explosive and poison gas shells onto the French positions. The earth shook, the sky turned a sickening yellow-green, and the air filled with the deafening roar of the barrage. The stormtroopers waited for the signal, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They knew that in minutes, they would charge across no man's land and into the pulverized French trenches. What they didn't know was that they were about to attack an army that wasn't there. They were walking, with perfect German precision, straight into one of the most brilliant and deadly traps of the entire war. A trap that would not only devour their army but would mark the beginning of the end for the German Empire. To understand the genius of this trap, we must go back to the spring of 1918. Germany, having defeated Russia on the Eastern Front, had moved hundreds of thousands of veteran troops to the west. They now held a temporary numerical advantage, and Ludendorff knew it was his last chance to win the war before a million fresh American soldiers tipped the scales irrevocably. He launched a series of massive offensives, codenamed Michael, Georgette, and Blucher York. These attacks were initially successful, using new stormtrooper tactics to break through the static trench lines that had defined the war for years. They pushed the Allies back dozens of kilometers, the deepest advances seen since 1914. But they never achieved the decisive breakthrough. The German army was bleeding itself white, losing its best and most experienced men in costly assaults. The Allied commander-in-chief, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, knew another attack was coming. But where? And how could they stop it? The answer came from a general who had been disgraced just a year earlier, Philippe Pétain. Pétain, the hero of Verdun, had seen firsthand the folly of packing the frontline trenches with men, only to have them annihilated by enemy artillery. After the disastrous Nivelle offensive in 1917, which led to widespread mutinies in the French army, Pétain had developed a new, radical defensive philosophy. It was called défense en profondeur, or defense in depth. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Instead of treating the front line as an unbreakable wall, Pétain envisioned it as a flexible, elastic cushion. The forward trenches, the ones that would bear the full brunt of the German artillery bombardment, would be held by only a handful of machine gunners and observers. Their job was not to hold the line, but to act as a tripwire to fire on the enemy, disrupt their formations, and then fall back. The real battle would not be fought here. The main line of resistance was to be established 2 to 3 kilometers behind the front, well out of range of the initial, devastating German barrage. This main line would be heavily fortified, manned by the bulk of the infantry, and supported by the full weight of the French artillery. The front zone was, in essence, a massive pre-planned killing floor. French intelligence, through aerial reconnaissance and daring trench raids, had pinpointed the exact sectors where the German attack would fall. With this knowledge, French and American artillery commanders spent weeks pre-registering their guns not on the German trenches, but on their own forward positions. Every shell hole, every communication trench, every potential assembly area in the sacrificial zone was methodically plotted. When the German stormtroopers advanced into these seemingly conquered trenches, they would be walking into a perfectly sighted artillery trap. For the German soldiers, it was a concept so alien to their own doctrine of aggressive forward defense that they couldn't comprehend it. And on July 15th, they would learn its brutal lesson. As the German artillery barrage lifted, the stormtroopers went over the top. They charged across no man's land, expecting to find the French trenches filled with dead and dazed defenders. Instead, they found nothing. The trenches were eerily empty, shattered by the bombardment but almost completely devoid of soldiers. A few scattered machine gun posts opened fire, then fell silent as the crews retreated through prepared communication trenches. The Germans were confused, but their orders were to advance. They pushed forward, pouring into the first, second, and even third lines of the French trench system, believing they had achieved a stunning, bloodless breakthrough. But as they moved deeper into the empty labyrinth, a new sound filled the air, a terrifying, rising scream. At precisely 1:45 a.m., thousands of French 75mm and American 155mm guns opened fire in a massive, coordinated counter-barrage. The shells didn't fall randomly. They fell with chilling precision on the exact positions the German stormtroopers now occupied. The empty trenches they had just captured became their graves. The French had turned their own front line into a death trap. German soldiers were shredded by shrapnel, buried in collapsing dugouts, and vaporized by direct hits. The assault, which had begun with such confidence, descended into chaos and slaughter. Communication broke down. Units were pinned down, cut off, and systematically destroyed. A key part of this unbreakable wall was held by the American 3rd Infantry Division. Positioned on the south bank of the Marne, they faced the brunt of the German assault. While French units on either side of them were forced to give ground, the 3rd Division, under the command of Major General Joseph Dickmann, held its line absolutely. The Germans threw pontoon bridges across the river and charged, but they were met by a storm of American rifle and machine gun fire. One regiment, the 38th Infantry, fought off attacks from three sides, refusing to yield an inch of ground. Their commander, Colonel Ulysses G. McAlexander, famously walked the front lines under heavy fire, encouraging his men and repositioning units to plug gaps. It was here that the division earned its eternal nickname, the Rock of the Marne. Their commander's order, Nous resterons là, we will remain here, became their defiant creed. By midday on July 15th, Ludendorff's Friedensturm, the Great Peace Offensive, was a catastrophic failure. The German army had thrown its last reserves into the attack and had been bled white in Pétain's elastic trap. They had gained nothing but a few kilometers of empty, shattered trenches at an unbearable cost. The psychological shock to the German high command was profound. Their unstoppable stormtrooper tactics had been defeated. Their final gamble had failed. The initiative, which they had held for 4 agonizing months, was about to be wrested from their hands. Marshal Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, saw his moment. He had been holding his own reserves, including fresh, aggressive American and French divisions, for just this opportunity. On July 18th, just 3 days after the German offensive began, Foch unleashed a massive counterattack against the now exhausted German flank. Led by hundreds of French Renault FT tanks, Allied troops smashed into the German lines. The same German soldiers who had been marching confidently towards Paris were now in a desperate fight for survival, their flank collapsing, their supply lines threatened. The psychological reversal was total. For the first time, German soldiers saw tanks advancing on them in massive numbers, with seemingly endless waves of infantry behind them. This counterattack marked the beginning of the end. The Second Battle of the Marne turned from a German offensive into an Allied victory. Ludendorff was forced to call off his attack and begin a general retreat. The great German spring offensives were over. The tide of the war had turned for the final time. The battle was the strategic bookend to the First Battle of the Marne in 1914. The first had saved Paris and started the stalemate of trench warfare. The second saved Paris again and began the final, rolling offensive that would end the war just 100 days later. The story of the Battle of Champagne is the story of a hidden front, not of earth and steel, but of intellect and strategy. It was a victory won not by brute force, but by the willingness to think differently, to sacrifice ground to save men, to turn a defensive line into a weapon. The German stormtroopers who charged into the empty trenches that day were not defeated by a lack of courage or skill. They were defeated by a superior idea. They had planned to attack an army, but instead, they attacked a brilliantly designed trap. And in doing so, They exhausted Germany's last reserves of strength and sealed the fate of their empire, all because they never imagined that the enemy they sought was waiting for them, miles away, patiently watching them walk into the killing zone.